Welcome. Today we are going to be taking a look at another type of research method, and that is experimental design. We've talked about descriptive research methods before, in which the researchers attempting to describe what they're observing. We've talked about correlation studies as predictive, meaning that they offer a prediction of what behaviors to expect in the future. Experimental research is the only type of research that is going to attempt to explain causes for behavior. It's going to try to establish causal link between variables. And we'll get at exactly how it does that, what benefits that has for us, and what limitations that has as well. So again, as we just talked about, we're attempting to establish a causal relationship between two variables. And how would you go about doing that? Ultimately, what you're doing as a researcher is you're attempting to control for all other variables so that you can get at this one variable and see what its effect is on something else. It doesn't necessarily have to be that simplistic. You could be narrowing it down to a few variables, but the more variables that you have going on, the more complex it gets and the more it may affect your ultimate results. So let's talk about how we might go about setting up an experiment. First, you have a research question. You have something that you're trying to answer. And so one example of a research question that many have researched over the years is, can aggressive or violent behavior be learned? In other words, if you were living in a home with a violent parent and you see that parent abusing his or her spouse, you see that parent abusing other siblings, you see that parent or you have that parent abusing you violently, can that then be passed down to you by learning it? By simply observing that behavior, are you learning it and therefore becoming more aggressive? And so researchers have attempted to get at that question. Can you, just by observation alone, can you learn to be more aggressive or violent? And so you have to then form some sort of testable hypothesis. A hypothesis that you can actually carry out in a laboratory. So for example, we could turn a general statement such as, can aggressive or violent behavior be learned, to a more testable hypothesis, a little bit more specific. If children watch aggressive models, then they will exhibit similar aggressive behavior. Okay, so that's testable. You have models exhibiting aggressive behavior, and then you measure aggressive behavior in the children and see if it increases or leads to aggressive behavior. And in fact, what we're talking about here is something that has been carried out in a classic experiment by Albert Bandura that's affectionately known as the Bobo doll experiment, in which children were asked to watch adult models beating up a Bobo doll, essentially, playing aggressively with it. And they were trying to measure whether the watching of the adult model would then lead to aggressive behavior in the children. Now, let's talk about, using this example, let's talk about the various components of an experiment. We talked about the researchers are manipulating one variable. That variable that the researcher is manipulating, that is the independent variable. It's the thing that the researcher is in control of. And so in this case, the independent variable is that aggressive behavior that is exhibited by the adult models. And you see a still shot on this slide of one of the adult models punching the Bobo doll in the face while she sits on it. So that's the variable that's manipulated by the researchers. So some children will watch an aggressive model, and other children could watch a model that's playing in a non-aggressive way with the Bobo doll. And in fact, you could even make it a little bit more complex, which Bandura did. You could have physical aggression. You could have verbal aggression. You could look at a lot of different factors such as that as well. Then ultimately we're trying to measure something. And in this case, we're trying to measure, does watching this violent adult lead to aggressive behavior in children? And that thing that we're measuring is what we call the dependent variable. And the dependent variable in this experiment would be the rates of aggression exhibited by the children. So you see some examples here of the children acting aggressively towards the Bobo doll. We have the one boy pointing the gun in the Bobo doll's face, and ultimately he's poking the Bobo doll in the face with the gun. We have the girl slapping the Bobo doll repeatedly, and both playing in a violent manner with the Bobo doll. So you're ultimately measuring those rates of regression. Now, it does raise a question that we've talked about in other areas of these videos, and that is, how do you define aggressive behavior? What exactly is aggressive behavior? Do you count pushes, or does it have to actually be some sort of hit? Does the violence with weapons count, or the toy weapons? There's a lot of different factors that you have to consider when defining exactly what is an aggressive behavior by the child. And so those are some things that the researcher would need to explain in their write-up on the paper. All right, so these operational definitions are what we're talking about here. Statement of how the variables are defined. They have to be measurable and they have to be replicable. And so with Bandura, you would want to see from this study a clear explanation of what the adults were doing with the Bobo doll. Exactly how were they being violent with the Bobo doll? You would not, a study that just said adults are going to act aggressively towards the Bobo doll is not a study that's tightly controlled. It's not one that's well set up, because one adult's definition of aggression may be different from another adult's definition of aggression. And so you may have different children watching different adult models behaving in very different ways with the Bobo doll. So you'd want to clearly define what the expectations are of the adults with the Bobo doll. So you have to clearly and operationally define your independent variable in that way. Again, as we just talked about, the dependent variable you need to define in a way that's measurable, because ultimately the way you're measuring this is you're having observers watching these children, and we need to have consistent results with that. We need to know that each observer is going to rate the same amount of aggression from the child while they're watching the child play with the Bobo doll. So operational definitions are highly important for a process that we call replication. And replication is extremely important in really any field, but in psychology as well. One study doesn't really demonstrate much. Multiple studies carried out in different environments with different populations, all centered around a similar research question. If those multiple studies get similar results, then we could start to really buy into those results as more meaningful than just kind of one study that says one thing and doesn't go in line with any other studies that have been out there. And in fact, one of the things we'll talk about later in this or actually throughout the year, is how a lot of recent psychological research, other researchers have found it very difficult to replicate that research. So as you're setting up your experiment, you have your independent variable and your dependent variable. You have and now there's other variables that you would want to control for. Control variables are those that you want to remain constant and unchanged. The better you do this, the better your experiment is going to establish that causal relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. And so when we're taking a look at Bandura's study, there could be a variety of control variables that you'd want to have in play. Maybe you'd want to control for the child's age and make sure that all the children are of the similar age as they're playing with the Bobo doll. Maybe you'd want to control for their backgrounds, and in terms of their parental backgrounds, exposure to violence in the past. There could be a variety of things that you may come up with that you would want to control for as best you can. Now, there's always things that come up that you can't necessarily control for. For example, that violent background. Maybe you can't really ascertain exactly how violent their background has been, how aggressive they are with their peers. And so how do you control for those factors? Well, the way that researchers control for those factors is by what we call random assignment, meaning that any participant in a study has equal opportunity of being in either the control group or the experimental group. And in this research, the experimental group will be the one that's exposed to aggressive behavior. The control group will be the one that's not. And that random assignment, therefore, controls for those other variables, especially the larger your sample gets, the more it's able to control for those other factors out there. Factors that you don't control for, factors that you allow to possibly influence the dependent variable other than your independent variable, those are what we call confounding variables. These are, and by confounding we mean it can mess up your research. It can mess up your research. It can ultimately lead to you not being able to tell if it was the independent variable that caused the change in the dependent variable, or if there was these confounds that ultimately caused that change. So you want to limit as much as possible any confounding variables in your research. Now we've kind of talked about a little bit about population and samples. When you're setting up your experiment, let's imagine that we want to run some sort of experiment at Granby High School. Obviously, we're not going to study every single student at Granby High School. It's not feasible, nor is it really necessary. What we need to do is come up with some sort of sample from that larger population. So when we use the term population in psychology class, we're talking about the group of people that we're looking to study. And from that population, we pull a sample who are actually going to participate in the study. Researchers often strive for random samples because, again, it helps you to generalize your findings to the larger population. And random sample is simply, again, giving everyone the opportunity, the equal opportunity to either be or to participate in the experiment or not. And so if we're doing this with Granby High School, you could simply put everyone's name into, a large bucket and just kind of randomly pull them out. You can assign everyone a number and have a random number generator produce, who's going to participate. There's a variety of ways of doing that. Some researchers believe it's important to go a step further and produce what we call a stratified random sample. And that gets a little bit more complex because what you're saying in a stratified random sample is our population is heterogeneous. It has lots of different subgroups. And we need to do something to make sure that these subgroups are represented well in our study and represented at an equal percentage to their representation of the population as a whole. And so, for example, at Granby High School, as you produce a stratified random sample, you would want to make sure that various ethnic groups are represented the same way they're represented in the general Granby population. Maybe you'd want to make sure that athletes versus non-athletes, IB versus non-IB, whatever it might be. You could, if you thought that these different populations were, the differences were significant enough that you would need to have everyone represented at the right ratio, then you might want to go for a stratified random sample. But as you might imagine, doing so becomes more complex and can be very difficult to do. And while random sample, as a side note, is something that many researchers strive for, it is important to note that a lot of times researchers just can't do it because of practicality reasons. And so a lot of research is simply done what we call with opportunity sampling, meaning that they are just pulling groups of people that are available to them. Understand that limits the extent to which you can generalize your results at that point. If it's just opportunity sampling, you really can't generalize beyond the group that you're studying. Random sample allows you to generalize to that larger population. And again, once you've got your sample, you then have the random assignment that we've already talked about. It controls for pre-existing differences, those confounding variables that you might not be able to control for otherwise. Now, one of the factors that researchers consider when setting up an experiment are ethics. Ethics are what are considered essentially right or wrong in conducting your studies. And there are some fundamental rules that psychologists agree upon that need to be followed. These rules are established by the American Psychological Association, and they're also established by local boards, typically usually at a college or university where these researchers work. They have their own ethical standards that must be met. And some fundamental ethical standards are participants must give informed consent, and they must have the ability to give informed consent. And so if they have some sort of disorder or some sort of brain trauma that makes them unable to give informed consent, some ethics boards may allow you to get around that by getting informed consent from the family, but at least raises an ethical question. By informed consent, we mean that obviously consent means they agree to participate in the study. Informed means that they actually know what's going on in the study. Now that can be a dilemma because sometimes there's research that if you know what's going on in the study, it's gonna mess up the results. And so in those situations, ethics boards will often allow some deception initially, but if you're going to have to deceive a population by not telling them the true nature of the experiment, then you absolutely must at the end debrief them. And debriefing simply means that you are going to explain to them what the research was about, why the deception was necessary, and that type of thing. So that gets to our second issue: no unnecessary deception. If the deception is not necessary, then it's not going to be approved. Obviously, no harm, physical or mental or emotional. We'll take a look at some pretty well-known studies that have definitely violated that in the past, and why those wouldn't probably be allowed today. And the participants need to be given the right to withdraw at any time. This could be during the experiment, this could be before the experiment, this could be after the experiment's over, they still have the right to withdraw their results. And honestly, whether there's deception or not, you still want to debrief at the end just to make sure they're clear on what the purpose of the study was, and to give them an opportunity to see the results if they wish after it's all done. So these ethical standards are things that psychologists make sure that their research is falling under. So again, when we're talking about experiments, we're talking about the key issue about experiments that differentiates them from other research is their attempt to create a causal link. Now again, that's beneficial to us because it allows us to start to understand human behavior even better and understand what causes us to behave in certain ways. But it does have some profound limitations. And one of the biggest limitations is that by definition, experiments lack what we call ecological validity, meaning that they don't necessarily tell us a whole lot about what's going on in the real world. So let's go back to this. Does watching aggressive models lead to more aggressive behavior in the children? So what Bandura found is that children who watched aggressive models tended to be more aggressive with the Bobo dolls. But what does that really tell us about the real world? First of all, how many times are children really just asked to sit down and watch someone beat up a Bobo doll? Secondly, does children acting aggressive towards a Bobo doll really relate to children acting aggressive towards other humans in real life? And in that way, is it really predicting anything about how humans would react beyond how they act towards a toy that, in all honesty, is really made to kind of be beat up? I mean, isn't that the point of a Bobo doll? You hit it and it pops back up. Experiments, by definition, lack that ecological validity when they're done very well, because the whole point is to control for all other factors. And that simply just does not happen in the real world. All right, so that's our presentation today on experimental research. This is just a brief introduction. We'll get into much more detail about experimental research as we go throughout the year. Again, if you have any questions, email me. Otherwise, have a good night.